So we'd like to thank our co-sponsoring bookstores, Max Backs, Loganberry Books, and Learned Owl, where you can buy Roxanne's books in person or online. There is no need to buy her books from Amazon. You could, but we don't recommend it. Thanks also for the support of the following co-sponsoring organizations: American Indian Movement, Ohio, Black on Black Crime, Inc., Cleveland Jobs with Justice, Cleveland Nonviolence Network, the Cuyahoga County Progressive Caucus, End Poverty Now, Hip Hop Congress, Interreligious Task Force on Central America and Colombia, Lake Erie Native American Council, Northeast Ohio Black Health Coalition, Ohio Poor People's Campaign, and Young Latino Network. Dawn, is Philip in the room? Do we know?
Philip, are you here? I'm prepared to give a land acknowledgement.
Okay,
Philip is
Don
a little
Bryant.
bit late. Philip Yenyo is the director of American Indian Movement of Ohio, and he did a land acknowledgement for the first part of our series on settler colonialism back in January. So you could see that on video, of course. That was with Mazen Kamsia of Occupied Palestine. We would like to acknowledge that we gather today on land originally stewarded by the Wyandot, the Delaware, Shawnee, Ottawa, Miami, Eel River, Way, Chippewa, Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Plankashaw, Kaskaskia, Mingo, Seneca, and Ojibwa people. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who lived here and cared for it.
Okay. Thank you, Don. Okay. A few months ago, a dear friend lent me Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States. And he said it was the most consequential book that he'd read in many years. I read it and I thought, we need to invite Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz to Cleveland virtually to have her visit on Zoom. As George Santayana said in 1905, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And repeating our past is exactly what the US and its citizens continue to do. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's latest book, Not a Nation of Immigrants, further connects the most toxic elements in the DNA of these United States: settler colonialism, racism, violence, militarism, and white supremacy. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz grew up in rural Oklahoma, the daughter of a tenant farmer and a part Indian mother. She has been active in the international Indigenous movement for more than 4 decades and is known for her lifelong commitment to national and international social justice issues. Frank Joyce is a lifelong Detroit-based writer and activist. He is co-editor of The People Make the Peace: Lessons from the Vietnam Anti-War Movement, and he is currently writing a book about unlearning white supremacy. It is my great honor to welcome them to Cleveland and introduce to you now Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz and Frank Joyce.
Well, let me start by thanking Francis for the introductions and also for all of the sponsors who have worked on this event. Sadly, and we'll get into this right away, I think, it's talking about settler colonialism is still kind of a forbidden topic. And so just holding a gathering like this and creating opportunities to really take a look at this part of what I call the white way of thinking, or white supremacy, or colonialism, or however we want to refer to it, is in and of itself both an act of enlightenment and an act of resistance. And I want to segue from that to maybe start at the end of Roxanne's most recent book with this question, Roxanne. I'm finding in my day-to-day anti-racist work in my local community that not only is there a continuing sort of appalling ignorance about settler colonialism and how impactful it has been, but in some circles, even among self-proclaimed anti-racists, there's active resistance to talking about this. There's we were talking earlier, there's a kind of slap on the wrist that you risk if you don't focus 100% on the consequences of slavery and anti-Black racism. And because you call at the end of the book for a grassroots movement of consciousness raising and education and so on about settler colonialism, I wonder if you could share with us some of your own experience in thinking about where does that resistance come from, do you think?
Well, I think that last part of the book, I'm making a plea to immigrants who read. I really wrote it thinking of an audience of immigrants, or not just citizens who are children of immigrants, because it's intergenerational trauma that set off coming to the United States for people of color in particular, but it's not that easy even for some Europeans. So my plea was specifically to a grassroots movement for immigrants to really take a leadership role. And some have. I found some incredible autobiographies, especially by South Asians and some Somali articles and books in which they recognize how can I, as a war refugee, coming, not for the American dream, but just not to be killed and to be in a safe place, how can I deal with the fact that I'm on stolen land? And that was so rewarding for me to find that there are. So it makes me think, and of course I know in person, people like Mandami, who is wrote Neither Settler Nor Native, is very, very conscious. And he himself, as a South Asian, that his ancestors were forced to go to all over the place, the West Indies, to Fiji, to Africa, and ended up in Uganda. And so in, sort of default being settlers on African land. So it's a very complex, but yeah, the scold is, let's not get into that, because we want, a kind of simple line to present to people to change things, because it is difficult. It's very, very complex. It can't be just black and white. I found it particularly interesting looking at the African immigrants and their consciousness. They come from a place where Blackness is the norm. Mm-hmm. They're not inferiorized in any way. Their countries may be on a larger scale, being former colonies and all, but they themselves are, have their cultures, their languages, their identity that goes back thousands of years, their home place. So they come as very confident immigrants. And especially if they're refugees, like the Somali refugees, they're placed. You don't have a really choice where you live when you're a refugee, right, being funded. You get placed. And often they separate people, like the Cambodians, Vietnamese, they separated them so that they would integrate, that they wouldn't form communities. A very cruel thing to do, to put them in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Cambodians, where there are very few Asians at all, much less Cambodians. And while, some are in California, some are in Minnesota, and they can't, they now with social media and all, there more can be done to form community. But so the African immigrants being then, or refugees being put in very poor Black communities where there are police shootings, and the usual thing we know about how descendants are of enslaved people in the United States are still treated today. And although there's a history of slavery in Africa, generally their ancestors hadn't been enslaved. They may have been deported, but they hadn't been enslaved in place. Yeah. So they have this sense of confidence of who they are. And some, those who are writing are critiquing the community and say some become literally anti-Black or anti-African American, and look down on these, they don't see themselves as kin, because Blackness is not a color to them. They're confident who they are. So that complication was very interesting to me. And of course, there is you can tell from our wonderful representative who's Somalian from Minnesota that they have built ties with the African American community, and it's very powerful in Washington and in Minnesota, where Somalians were placed, and really all white neighborhoods in some cases. So they get treated, exactly like the African Americans by the police and all.
Who can't, of course, tell the difference. And we just saw a very dramatic example of that in Grand Rapids, Michigan. But I think I want to pick up on that theme with regard to the premise of Not a Nation of Immigrants in this way for a minute, before we get to talking more maybe about Irish and the more traditional stereotype of immigrants. I wrote a piece recently in which I talked about some of the attraction to Trump is from white people feeling disoriented and being told by the media often that you white people are about to become a minority. And in a white supremacist culture for generation after generation now, that is, I think, disorienting to some white people. But part of what's so important about your book is what you were just talking about. And that is that so many if we're about to become a majority minority population, which is a problematic concept in and of itself, but in a common sense way, so many of the people of color who are in the United States did not come here voluntarily. Now, the most obvious example of that, of course, is enslaved people from Africa, and then people who were enslaved
they had rescheduled
by the domestic slave trade. But this shift in the population, the demographics of the United States, which in fact has, for example, huge numbers of Hispanic people living in North Carolina or Vietnamese people living in Pittsburgh, et cetera, is because people came as refugees in the broad sense of the word to serve various and sundry geopolitical, economic, and so on interests of the culture and of the society. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more. I agree. One of the most powerful passages in the book is the experience that you describe of Somalis. But Viet Nguyen, for example's book about the experience of Vietnamese refugees, and it's no picnic to come here as a non-white so-called immigrant.
Yeah, it's and I think it's unexpected because people come from not just Africans, but others, you know, from Arab countries and South Asia. Where say they come as Muslims, they're usually in a place that is a majority Muslim. It's the norm, you know, like Blackness in Africa, it's the norm.
Uh-huh.
And they come and they're, you know, they may read about it, but they think, well, you know, that's just, I don't think it really sinks in until they see the prejudice. And yeah, one of the most powerful books I read was by a Muslim Moroccan who did not at all come as a refugee. She came as a student, and then she fell in love and married a US fellow student and applied for citizenship, the dual citizenship. You know, she wasn't in any way planning to stay, but, you know, things happened. And this was all, you know, like she got her citizenship like a day before the 9/11 thing. And she was so happy, you know, this was easy. It didn't take too long because she's married. And right away, she starts the, you know, the anti-Muslim stuff. It was so, she felt so vulnerable, you know, and didn't tell people, you know, I mean, people looking at her wouldn't necessarily, they did assume she was Muslim because they think all Arabs and all, for instance, Palestinians, I think only about 40% are actually Muslim. There are many, many Christians of many different denominations. And so they assume, you know, because she's dark skinned and is from North Africa, that she's Muslim. So that, you know, that kind of experience is, it's so pervasive. I think as you said, Viet Nguyen's book, Nothing Ever Dies, is not enough people read it. They read his novels are bestsellers, but that book is absolutely essential. He doesn't mince words at all, you know, about US imperialism. And his family was on the other side. His dad was an officer in the South Vietnamese army. They were Catholics, you know, I mean, this is coming from not, you know, some a National Liberation Front person. But just his experience, you know, coming at 10, 11 years old and experiencing the discrimination and and observing it too, in, you know, even in San Jose. So, yeah, I think I actually didn't answer your question, so you might want to.
Well, I was going to switch gears a little bit anyway. But segueing from Viet Nguyen, he's a great writer and he has a lot of great lines. And one of the most powerful, as we think about who lives in, let's just stick with the 48 states for the moment, and how the demographics of the United States have changed, and what a huge percentage of those are a result of what Viet Nguyen says, we are here because you were there. And so many of the non-white residents of the United States now are here because the United States invaded their country and waged war for years and years and years. and then, of course, didn't even win the war. I mean, the United States hasn't had a military victory, certainly since World War II, and Grenada and Panama don't count for various reasons. But let's move now to the other essential component of your book, and this idea of not being immigrants. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the idea of how recent is the very concept of being a nation of immigrants, and how that is really in and of itself a part of the evolution of a story, of a myth about who we are as a nation. Why did they have to come up with that not so many years ago?
Yeah, it's actually a liberal assumption and slogan, and Democratic Party and so forth. Certainly not the right wing. So it's not that accepted. It was the first thing that Trump took out of the government description on the website, US Gov website, was under the section on immigration. It said, we are a nation of immigrants, and he took that out. It's back in again, reinstated it, the Democrats. So it goes back and forth. But it actually, when I was raving about not a nation of immigrants back in the early 2000s, it somehow, well, I think to do with the Muslim ban and all that and the shutdown on immigrants, even before Trump,
Mm-hmm.
that there was a renewal of it. I just kept hearing it, and so I wrote this blog, before social media. We had these, kind of rants that could become viral, and this one went viral. Stop saying this is a nation of immigrants. So all I was dealing with was settler colonialism. And I thought that slogan was, how you don't know the origin of something, everyone says it. And it's just, I just thought it, probably, I don't know, dated back to the early 20th century, at least, when there was they needed industrial workers, in the East European Jews and Polish, Catholics were coming, and that those who needed them would say, well, we're a nation of immigrants. We got to welcome these people because they're going to work for us cheap. But no, it was John F. Kennedy, who became president in 1960, but he was senator of Massachusetts. Before that, in 1958, he started planning. I mean, this is all known. I didn't have to do research. I mean, once I discovered it was him, I said, oh my God.
Hidden in plain sight, so to speak.
I didn't know he invented this term, but think about it. He was the first president, child of immigrants. All the rest are descendants of settlers. They're either Anglo or Scots-Irish, and of course, all Protestant. And for him to break through that, he had to do a lot of footwork. And if you remember, he barely won, and maybe didn't at all with the Chicago Irish manipulations. But that used to be when presidents accepted their loss. Richard Nixon.
So quaint.
Accepted it. Yeah, and so I think he came up with this as a way of, because he was already a popular figure, people really liked him. I liked him. I thought, oh, he's so good looking, his family, and there was a lot of publicity about him, and the book was a bestseller. it still sells, it has sold millions and millions of books. It's come out in all kinds of editions. If you go on Amazon, there's a bunch of them, page after page of different dates, different introductions, different epilogues and interpretations, and none of them talk about settler colonialism until mine. So he, I think he planned, maybe he probably had Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who was his house, historian advisor,
Mhm.
thinking it up to, being a part of it. I don't know if he thought of it himself, but the book mainly deals with Irish immigration. I would say 3/4 of it. And
So-
the Irish refugees, especially this sympathetic group that he then kind of placed himself in, even though his parents weren't, a part of that. They came later and wealthy. So I think he was trying to build a platform where he would be acceptable as a Catholic and as a child of immigrants. And I think it worked. It worked in the sense that it was a time when people were becoming, well, the civil rights movement was going on, that prejudice, that word was, you didn't want to be prejudiced against someone. Catholicism was still, well, I don't know. I grew up a Southern Baptist at that time in the 50s. And we thought, Southern Baptists think Catholics are the devil, and totally evil and trying to take over the country. So I'm sure no Southern Baptists voted for John F. Kennedy. That's changed. They kind of merged with this Christian nationalism, the Catholicism and Protestantism is interesting, but that's my next book.
Well, let's talk not about your next book necessarily, but about that a little more with regard to the Irish. And in the full disclosure department, I was raised, you can tell from my last name that
Yes,
there's
no one would
Irish
guess.
heritage there. But I was raised to wear orange on St. Patrick's Day because
Oh my
my
God.
Irish ancestors were Protestant Irish. And I've joked about this for a long time about how I'm descended of, from every major imperialist group ever in the history of the world.
The first colonizers.
The first colonizers, exactly. But it also had the other side of the coin is that it, gave me some experience in being the nonconformist and in resisting the dominant culture as a result of that. But I say all of that to get to one of the many deep points in Not a Nation of Immigrants. And that's this idea of how white people, white Europeans in particular, and especially the Scots and the Irish, and in a different way, the Italians, because that's mostly who we think about when we think about immigrants, indigenize themselves and create the mythology that we, not just we stole this land fair and square, but that we're entitled to it somehow, that it is our birthright, whether that comes from the Monroe Doctrine or the doctrine of discovery or whatever. And you talk about various ways in which this happens. And so I'm inviting you to talk about that a little bit more, be it relative to the Irish or the Scotch or in Appalachia or whatever. But it's this idea that we, white people, have convinced ourselves that this really, we're entitled to all of this.
Yeah, I didn't realize that you were Scots Irish Protestant with that name Joyce, because I know James Joyce. So you could have gotten by with
it's a form of passing.
pretending. But my Dunbar really stands out because that is Scots, Scots Irish. And my dad used to say, I would say, are we Irish? Because we, there are a lot of Irish around. I really liked our Irish neighbors, and I liked the way they talked, and they didn't have the Okie accent. They had this, this brogue, and I liked the music. And I wanted to be Irish. And he said, no, we were the Black Irish. We were the bad ones. So even though he wasn't educated, he had that consciousness of, being the ones that oppressed the Irish. And that always, it still puzzles me. But anyway, the Scots-Irish, particularly, I have a section on them indigenizing. The Irish, I'll make a comparison because the Irish Catholics is a very different thing. The Scots-Irish, they come later. They come not in the 1600s, but in the early 1700s. That's when they start pouring in. They're already seasoned colonizers. They come from, North Ireland, in which they were given land taken from the small Irish farmers, who then nearly started to have to work as tenants for the Scots-Irish. They're not big barons. I mean, there are big barons, but they're mostly English, some Scots, but they have bigger farms and more commercial farms, of course, potato, single crop. And the Irish peasants are pushed off their land and have to work for them. So that's the first really systematic settler colonialism, a plan that Cromwell made and carried it out very brutally. So they were seasoned, colonized settler colonialists when they came. It's just in their DNA, it's just, that's how we are, that's our strength. They're proud of it. So they settle. They're not rich. Most of them aren't rich. Andrew Jackson was one of these, of course, and his family settled in first Western Pennsylvania and then in Kentucky. And so they started moving in the 1720s, moving into areas that were they weren't yet prohibited, but they really were not legally a part of the British Empire. The sort of Indian country, the Appalachian, the eastern side of the Appalachians, and the western side was, more French fur traders there. So, this almost was one factor that led up to the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War between the French and British. But anyway, they started going up and settling and literally killing Cherokees and taking their land. This was the Cherokee part of the Appalachian part of the very large Cherokee Nation, which was also all over Georgia. And that they knew how to do that, just go push these people out, kill them, burn their crops. And then they're on the periphery. They come and fight them, they constantly trying to get their land back and fighting them. All of this is kind of outside any colonial structure or anything, the colonies. The Virginia, it was, most of it was from West Virginia, from Western Virginia. People going there. So it's a majority, is still today about 90% Scots-Irish, the Appalachians. And that's where my family came from. They came from Kentucky. They came over from Kentucky. I'm sure they did the same things. But they didn't ever become landholder. They got in the trek. They trekked out, those who didn't make it when they opened. That is, when they ethnically cleansed and then opened new land. So they went from Kentucky to Missouri when it was taken, when the Spanish let go of it. And it had already been pretty ethnically cleansed by the Spanish. So they came from Missouri and then to Oklahoma, and then they scattered everywhere. There clusters in, the Northwest, all over California from the Dust Bowl, and in Texas in particular. So that was, they brought masonry with them, very strongly. It was already there, but the Scottish Rite they brought with them. So this was, they had a, after all the coal, coal left and all, in the early 60s, the group of intellectuals started rewriting history. Not that it was written very well already, but making the claim that they were the original people, that there had been it was empty land. There hadn't been any Cherokees there. And, that they were the indigenous people. So that's the settler colonialism, means that you have a sense of place, that it's always been your people's land. You find that with the Hispanos in New Mexico, who are settler colonialist Spanish, and then they're colonized by the US, but they still hold all that land that they took from the Pueblo Native people. And so that self-indigenizing, now with the Irish, the way they self-indigenize was through a mythology that already existed in Ireland, about I can't remember the details now, it's in the book, but some ancestor who may have been mythical or real took to the seas. There were seafaring people on an island in the Atlantic, and that they first, that this was long time ago. And Kennedy lays this out in his Nation of Immigrants. He says, when he gets the Native Americans what to call them, he just has a little bit on it, but he says, well, they don't really fit into this. He doesn't. He ends up calling slave settlers, or immigrants. But with the Native Americans, he's obviously puzzled, and he says they don't really fit into this. He says, but he says there is an Irish knowledge. He doesn't call it a myth, but information, that the people who were here, in North America, when the British came, when colonialists came, when this earlier person, this long ago person, when they came there to settle, discovered America, that the people who were living there were not the original Aboriginal. He uses that word. They weren't the Aboriginal people that who are called the Native Americans now were invaders who came and killed all the original people out. So that what they're doing is they're returning to their homeland. So Amazing. They go way back in some, very, very circuitous. It's a mythology, but it's actually quite current still, yes. in the Irish Catholic community. Yeah, it's very disturbing. These I had never really thought it through before, but these three examples, the Hispanos and the Appalachians and the Irish, and then of course the Italians, they were given, it's true that Columbus was Italian and Catholic, but the Catholic Church really worked to say they were the first discoverers. They're related to the first discoverers of America too.
Let's fast forward here for a minute into something that's still quite contemporary. And let me pose a question this way. How dare you have the nerve to question Alexander Hamilton?
Yes.
Which you spend considerable time very effectively doing in the book, but in a very illuminating way with regards to how white supremacy constructs the mythology and reconstructs the mythology to adapt to changing times. And so that one of the things I've been saying of late is that we have to acknowledge 500 years in that white supremacy is obviously a very powerful idea. It's lasted a long time now, but it lasts a long time in part because white people are good at reinventing it. And if the play Hamilton wasn't an example of that, what the heck was? We're getting a message, we're running a little long, but maybe a quick answer to that, and then I guess we'll go to the questions from the chat.
Yeah, that was really the what made me write the book was the Hamilton, the musical, Hamilton, the Revolution, Lin-Manuel's blockbuster. I couldn't, I already knew these things, and I just I couldn't believe this incredible. I mean, it was like the warmongering we see now. This energized. Liberals, and especially young people. And he was giving away tickets, these expensive tickets, but to school children all over the place. And especially young Black kids, they see these founding fathers being Black. He takes slavery completely out of the occasion. And makes it's so twisted in those ways, but they also make him an immigrant. This was what annoyed me most, is surely this is surely taught. I actually went and looked at a middle school textbook, and it is actually taught that the colonies in the Caribbean and the colonies in North America were all, everyone was all the white people were British citizens. And that they were like, today, if I moved from, which I did, from Oklahoma to California to go to university, I wouldn't be an immigrant to California. That would be absurd. Oh, I'm immigrating to California. So going from St. Nevis, a slave colony in the Caribbean, where he was from, to New York to go to Columbia University. While it was still a colony, New York was a colony. There were 13 colonies and all the colonies. That's just, moving to a different colony in the British colonies. So to call him an immigrant is a total distortion of what immigration is. And what Ishmael Reed taught me with his attack of this, to the extent he wrote a play, and Toni Morrison, before she died, actually produced it, and on off Broadway in New York. And he focuses in on Lin-Manuel, because Lin-Manuel, who made it, kept saying he identified his father with Hamilton, because his father immigrated from the Caribbean to New York. And so he feels he's an immigrant, and he's a Puerto Rican. It's a colony. He's a colonized person. So that was but then I go into more details about how horrible Alexander Hamilton was. He's the one that brought us the first bank, brought us capitalism. He had capitalism figured out before Karl Marx did, but he loved it. He was. He set up, even during the War of Independence, he was second only to Washington with the military. He was militaristic. He's the one that led in how many troops was that? 500,000 troops, Revolutionary Army troops, to put down, the uprising over taxes, being taxed for their alcohol, for their alcohol production. And this was the Shays Rebellion. And this was, his idea of doing that. George Washington went halfway with him and then went away, kind of didn't want to be responsible for the bloodbath. He's a very militaristic person. The first corporation was born, the first corporation in North America was born during the War for Independence, established by Alexander Hamilton, and it was an armory. It was a gun making factory in Springfield Arms in Connecticut. Connecticut today is still, that is the one industry that has never gone offshore. It's made in America, Colt and Sour and, all these weapons. So that was, he shows that, that the US was born very militaristic, and he was, I would say, many degrees more militaristic than any other of the so-called founding fathers.
From whence we see the results today in a pretty linear way. I know we're over time, and is it Megan or Don or Francis, I think, has been paying attention to the chat and the questions. So
Yeah.
I think
Yes, Frank,
go.
let me, I'm gonna make another, and Megan is gonna handle the chat,
Okay.
the questions, and I'm gonna add her to the spotlight here. And let's see. Okay, all right, so yeah.
All right.
I want to thank everyone again here for before we do the Q&A. If you have a question, put the question in the chat. Megan will kind of curate the questions, and then we'll ask them. We'll voice them. Again, our three co-sponsoring bookstores are Max Backs on Coventry, Loganberry Books on Larchmere, and Learned Owl in Hudson. They are standing by and prepared to fill your orders, as they used to say. Again, we thank other co-sponsors: American Indian Movement Ohio, Black on Black Crime Inc., Cleveland Jobs with Justice, Cleveland Nonviolence Network, Cuyahoga County Progressive Caucus, End Poverty Now, Hip Hop Congress, Interreligious Task Force on Central America and Colombia, Lake Erie Native American Council, Northeast Ohio Black Health Coalition, Ohio Poor People's Campaign, and Young Latino Network. You can support us, Cleveland Peace Action Education Fund, actually, by becoming a member. Go to peaceactioncleveland.org/donate/join-donate, peaceactioncleveland.org. Okay, Megan, take it away.
All right, first question we have. White supremacy sounds evil. People will say, I'm not that. What is missed is that white is normal in the US and everything else is seen as foreign. How do we get the mainstream to accept this idea that only if you're white do you feel truly at home here?
Yeah. First, I want to say, tell everyone that in the chat, the wonderful Maureen O'Meara, who's obviously Irish historian, has given the whole story about St. Brendan and the discovery of America. So please read it. Yeah, white supremacy is a very negative identity to foist on people. It's hard to find a substitute. I think settler colonialism tries to make it understood that it's not all white. It's a way of being, and you don't have to be that way. It's an ugly way of being white supremacist. And they also, people identify it with very extreme groups who put on their chests, I am a white supremacist, like the Ku Klux Klan and the Charlottesville people chanting, "You will not replace us." They're proud white supremacists. So when we're talking about a country of white supremacy, I think it's always better to couch it like that than in a personal sense, because the descendants of these settlers, and it was an all-white founding. The founding fathers and only white people could be citizens of the country. that that their fate is sealed if they fall into this category, and they, like immigrants, have to not become settlers. These descendants of white people, I remember I was already I was an early anti-racist in Oklahoma, just because my last year of high school, I had gone 11 years to a rural, I grew up in a rural area, and my last year of high school, I went to Oklahoma City to go to a high school trade school. My last year of high school, worked almost full time and went to school. It was the poorest. It was all poor whites, a few Indians, but it was the first year of integration in Oklahoma in 1955. And so I witnessed for the first time the white supremacy attacking. It just seemed unfair. There were only about 12 of these young Black people. They obviously had been prepared. They didn't fight back. They were so they became I so admired them, their dignity, and their trying to teach these people. And it was just amazing. And then there were demonstrations downtown at, it never makes the books, but it was I think it was the first sit-in at the big drugstore downtown in Oklahoma City, Katz Drugs, that there was a very young woman, about 18 years old, who was leading it. And her face would be on television and local television. And I said, that's who I want to be. That's who I want to be. So I very early, fortunately, just by luck, my three older brothers and sisters, I would say, except for my brother, 2 years older than me, that I converted against white supremacy. But my older brother and sister were definitely white supremacists. So I don't know how we will go about that. I know that Frank was bringing that up, and we didn't really discuss it. So Frank, you might want to say something about it.
Well, just quickly, one of the things that this is almost an experiment, but I've been really focused in the last few years on local organizing in the white suburb that I mostly live in. And, there's this cliche about we need to have difficult conversations. Well, a difficult conversation is to ask, white people like to proclaim their racial innocence and proclaim it some more. And one of the common forms that takes is, well, my ancestors didn't have anything to do with slavery. But it's a different conversation with white people in talking about, well, did your ancestors have anything to do with settler colonialism? Because every white person's ancestor had something to do with settler colonialism. I don't care if you just arrived here yesterday. If you were a property owner, you had something to do with settler colonialism, and with the very system of private property and dividing the land up with, surveyors, and without deeds and so on and so forth, you couldn't have had the restrictive covenants, for example, that said the house couldn't be sold to a Negro. So in terms of white people coming to terms with their own ancestry, not for purposes of producing guilt, but for producing a situation in which people can begin to get a sense that maybe there's a different way to organize society than just having hierarchical racial categories. I find being able to talk about settler colonialism, and Roxanne, as you know, I give you a lot of credit for this. And as Don did earlier, the 2014 book, I think was a real eye opener and part of a continuum that brings us to this book. So I don't know, to my fellow white anti-racists, you really need to know however much you think you know about settler colonialism now, learn more. It'll help you in your work. That's my speech.
All right, next question. What is your definition of immigration?
Well, immigration, as opposed to settler colonialism, settlers, Mahmoud Mandami, I'm taking this from, he put it so succinctly, and I'll paraphrase it. The settlers come to what they consider empty land. That is, there may be people there, but they push them away purposely. That's the beginning of colonialism, Western colonialism. And immigrants are people who come to a place to join an already existing polity. So if the people who came to Jamestown, it's claimed the mythology is they were, poor, and of course the Puritans, they were discriminated against because of their religion. Had they come as immigrants, they would have joined these highly organized polities that they encountered right away. Some of them even already knew them because there were English and other ships, fishing, Irish and all, off the coast of, because the Spanish, came a whole century before. So there was a lot of activity off the shore, fishing and trading. Native people would go out and bring goods, including copper, which they, was all over the United States. They mined copper things, others, other things, foods, and trade them for skillets, ironware and stuff, blankets, but they had their own blankets. They would trade blankets. So they were not unknown, that these were highly civilized people with, many languages, like Europe had hundreds of languages at that time. And they, had they come to, they had already scoped it out, as a place to conquer. That was the intention, and the British Empire is to conquer this place and get rid of troublesome people, that they could invite people to, go have free land over there because they were overpopulated. After the fencing of the commons, there were many, many poor people, this was during the fencing of the commons, and really kind of deporting them. Many of them were indentured. And so that is an immigrant. They don't come to take over the country, even though Trump says Mexicans are trying to, maybe take back their territory, which is half the United States. They're a third of it. But they're not. They come to find jobs. So actually, Mexicans are, they're not settlers, they're not immigrants. I think they're actually nationals whose land was taken away. That's a whole different thing. But the immigrant at least comes as an innocent. And they come to the United States as an innocent, but only starting with the Irish refugees in the 1840s. There were no immigration laws. None. I mean, no one could come. The only law was only white Europeans could come. The Irish were poor, they were colonized, but they were blue-eyed blondes. And they didn't have to ask permission. They just came on any ship they could catch. It was almost like the Middle Passage in terms of people dying on en route because they didn't have food, get scurvy, they were get sick, die, throw them overboard. It was a horrible, horrible process. But that's the first time people came to join an already existing polity. All before that were settlers who came to get land, Anglo settlers, and a few French, a few Irish, wealthier Irish, and yet immigration, the first immigration law was not until 1882, and that was to exclude Chinese. And the second one, a few years later, was to broaden that to exclude all Asians. So that's what immigration is in the United States, is basically exclusion. That's the title of my, my book. So these people, the Irish didn't come as settlers, but they easily became settlers because they could, by the second generation, they could meld into they had more of a problem being Catholics than they did being Irish. But once the Eastern Europeans, darker people, different, some Catholics are Italian Catholics, but from the South, Sicilians who are dark, they got the same treatment as Black people. They were tremendously discriminated against. They came to work. Many of them wanted to go home, make enough money to go back home. The Italians, Eastern Europeans, it was pogroms for the Jews, constant pogroms, destroying their villages, killing their people over and over and over again. And also for people who were starving. Poland was very, people were starving there. Sweden people were starving. So these were, in a way, they were refugees too, and they weren't under any laws. Anyone could come from Europe. So it wasn't until 1924 that they just halted immigration from anywhere except Western Europe. And that didn't loosen up until the John F. Kennedy, I didn't mention that one good thing about him seeing himself as an immigrant is he had a lot of compassion for immigrants. And he did push through. Before he died, it didn't pass until after his death, but he did push it through during his presidency. And then Johnson did it, of opening to all people of the world. And then, of course, a lot of restrictions started getting placed, on people of color. But that's a long time of misery for people having very contingent status. No wonder they make up things that they really belong, as original people, because they just want to be accepted and not, killed and tortured and hired at the bottom, because they didn't speak English. That was a problem. The Irish spoke English because of the colonization. They spoke excellent English and wrote books and everything in English, but these were people who spoke Slavic languages and Italian and Yiddish.
Roxanne, a quick follow-up on that, which you've actually addressed in all your books. Part of how people become American, which is a problematic term in and of itself, even in more modern times, is by defining themselves as either anti-Black or anti-person of color. And of course, the role of the Irish in opposition to busing in modern times, for example, in Boston and in Pontiac, Michigan, for those of you from that area. And for those of you who know the history of Joe Biden, his political launching pad in Wilmington, Delaware, was essentially by jumping on the anti-busing bandwagon. But this dynamic by which you prove how American you are is by proving how in most cases anti-Black you are, but in other cases it can be anti-Asian, anti-Chinese, anti-whatever. I call this the melting pot of white supremacy.
Right.
But it's this how you achieve the whiteness is sort of your apex identity. And so, yeah, you might celebrate St. Patrick's Day, or if you're Italian, Columbus Day or whatever, but everybody knows you're an American because you have defined yourself in opposition to some one or all people of color. That's how you become an American.
And even with the Irish refugees, the Irish people knew that they were colonized, and they actually very early on identified with other colonized people. But the Irish refugees who came were here and dependent. They came to an already existing polity, and definitely they became more accepted when they started doing blackface, and when they started doing minstrels, and also hating, hating Black people. And many became slave patrollers. Of course, they became the police, literally became the police, the first police, and they also slave patrols. So this was their processing, to become white, to become totally acceptable. But yeah, the best thing to read on this, that is just so, and of course I quoted practically all of it in the book, is James Baldwin's essay, Price of the Ticket. Mm-hmm. This is on immigration. He says one memorable thing. He says, one day I see this person coming off the ship, and his obviously underfed. He has one little bundle of clothes. He's haggard. He has nothing. And a week later, or a day later, a week later, however he puts it, he's standing tall, and he's telling me to get out of his way, or making me work for him. So, but it's a very deep, penetrating essay, and I tried to capture it in that part where I was talking about that. I call it processing. It's almost like how Africans were processed, when in the Caribbean, all shined up and oiled and fed before they went on the auction block. And there was a certain kind of processing like that, of immigrants. And yeah, that anti-Blackness was certainly one key to being white. That meant you identified as white. So the darker skin mattered less and less.
All right. We have a couple more questions. My hometown, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, celebrates its European heritage, but not its Puerto Rican heritage. Why do cities acknowledge and praise European immigrants over non-white migrants, hence Puerto Ricans and immigrants?
I only know Bethlehem for its Moravian, the Moravian founding, I think. But yeah, say it again, say the question again. I got just thinking too much about Moravians. That's not right.
My hometown, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, celebrates its European heritage, but not its Puerto Rican heritage.
Right.
The cities acknowledge and praise European immigrants.
Yeah, it's very German, German language based. That is hopefully gets fixed, because there really are a lot of Slavic people in that area, and also Black people, and the Puerto Ricans, who jobs, worked in that area and stayed. And I suppose they should just, start their own holiday, and then City Hall, force it to recognize that, because probably these people, I mean, it would be a good educational thing for the people who identify as the original and white, to have this intervention, the intervention, because it probably won't come from them. I knew this in Oklahoma when I became so anti-racist and talked about it. I would be called an in lover, which was their favorite slur, and really treated badly. If you took a stand against them beating up on these Black students, I would go and tell them to stop and grab their arms and stuff, and they just turn on me. So people know it's dangerous, to make demands of white people. They can be very dangerous, protecting their territory. So I'm sure that's a very slow process in many of these places. It certainly has been in Oklahoma, where I come from, but it helps to have other immigrants come, to some cities are so poor, like Oklahoma City, and always in debt and not having funds, probably because of craft, stealing money and just corruption. But they volunteered, and a lot of poor places do volunteer to take refugees, and they get money. They get money for it, for doing that. And so these poor refugees, these Vietnamese refugees in Oklahoma City, they have been able to change the culture in ways I never imagined. And they're not political people, these refugees, and they're mostly from, South Vietnamese, not the North. And at first they'd be called the enemy, veteran, the soldiers that had been in Vietnam, said, we don't want these Vietnamese here. And they were very self-confident, and they were really good merchants. They have a whole section that got very run down. It used to be a really nice section of Oklahoma City. That's where they put them. It was kind of a, gang controlled. It was a dangerous place. That's where they settled these Vietnamese families. And what they did was remake it into a little Saigon, and with a whole 2-story supermarket where every single item in it is imported from Vietnam. And the Vietnam restaurants, you have to make reservations days ahead. So I think that it really did, just socializing like that at some level, they took it into their hands to do that. So I think that's probably, the Puerto Ricans being always identified with their homeland, which is colonized. They don't feel like they're immigrants or settlers, and they're not. They're very conscious of being visitors on Indian land, at least the, politicized Puerto Ricans I know. So it could be, they just, have their own community and have an interdependence that makes them not have to depend on these people. But it would be nice if those white people could learn something, maybe learn some Spanish, for instance,
All right, we have a question. Can you talk about the indigenous people's political systems that were in some ways superior to our so-called democracy?
Yeah, they were many different ways of, you know, of constructing village life and in the whole hemisphere. I really recommend what's his first name, Charles Mann, a science writer who wrote the book 1491. I use it a lot in Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States. And it really opened my eyes. There were a lot of things I just simply didn't know. And he probably didn't know when he started researching. But for one thing is how connected people were from Tierra del Fuego to the Arctic Circle and even to Alaska. They built roads all up and down. The center, the founding center that of North America was really Mesoamerica, Central Mexico, the corn, and then it went all the way to even the Amazon. They have found fossils of corn. So the corn was the bounding sacred item. Of course, all the people on the shores on both sides, somehow people think that Indians never got in a boat. I mean, they had these huge oceans on both sides. And so there's no talk of whether or not they said went and met the Hawaiians or what, you know, Polynesians going back and forth. But of course, that did happen. It's just did, you know, whether they can discover it or not. For one thing, they had one scientist track down. They said that how did the coconut get to South America? And they said, well, it floated, you know, it floated. And then the scientists went out and put a coconut in salt water, and the next day it was shriveled up. Salt water kills coconuts, so it had to be human beings that took it. So anyway, they were a polyglot of so many different kinds of cultures. And sticking just to North America, I mean, there weren't these borders. Of course, there were roads, like I say, on both coasts that went all the way down and then crisscrossed across North America and across, and people knew each other. They had different, depending on the you know, the conditions of farming. It's amazing how in the Southwest, of course, in the north, in the east, southeast, the so-called 5 civilized tribes, these, you know, one of the great centers of agricultural civilization, they had the most fertile land on earth. That's why, you know, the U.S. slave owners took it. But from the beginning, when they were taking it, they were the settlers were only using it and depleting it by commercial crops, non-food crops, tobacco, cotton, other fibers, indigo. And this, you know, this of course leaches the land. So the native people had, you know, left a lot of lands untended so it could refurnish itself. And white settlers looked at this and said, well, no one's there, you know, so we'll take that land. But that's, you know, that's for the future. That's where they'll go when they, you know, when the land they're on needs to be left alone for a time. So they had these ecological practices for survival. You know, it wasn't like, oh, well, we have to be nice to nature. This is, you know, that's why we're destroying ourselves now, because we've ruined everything. What the Anglos, the first thing they do is kill all the beavers off, you know, for their furs. They don't even eat beavers, and yeah, and so you have flooding and you have all the work that the beavers did, the human beings could not possibly manage to do and know about it. So they respected these animals. And one thing that really fascinated me were the New England villages, especially, from Virginia on up, that was a very forested area. And how they didn't go out tromping in the mud to hunt deer as usually portrayed. They brought deer, deer parks. They made deer parks. They cleaned out between the trees and allowed just succulent, just these things that deer love to eat, like candy, but very nourishing. And the deer came to them. And they lived perfectly free lives until they needed food. The people needed food, and then they would take the deer for food. But in the meantime, they were just on their, on their own, but close by. They didn't go out tromping around. The buffalo that we think of as in the plains, Native people took them, the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations of the Iroquois, brought them to the east. They weren't endemic to the east. So you have Buffalo, New York. Why doesn't anyone ever say, why is that place called Buffalo? That's not where the buffaloes were. Yes, they were there. They were all over the continent. They were all in the Southeast as well. So this and the way they used fire, they keep trying in California. The Native people up north keep trying to get these, firefighting people to understand how they can burn in order to prevent fires, but they can never quite get it right, because they want to use technology and they want to do this and that. So it's they've had a little bit of influence, but it's so mammoth, and so many scars that it's very hard to, put it back into a balanced place. But in the plains, they had, of course, buffalo grass, taller than a very tall man's head. So they wanted to keep that. They did manage it. They managed this these fields to make it very, very attractive to wildlife. But in general, one wonderful US textbook that came out in the 90s that was a revisionist textbook that doesn't get used much, titled their book, A Continent of Villages. Everyone lived in villages. It was very much like China, the village as the heartbeat, with fields all around. Everyone farmed at some point, in their, from the, the subarctic to Tierra del Fuego, they raised food out of the ground. So that's, of course, completely, they were more sitting ducks for invaders from outside, the European invaders, both in the Spanish and the because they didn't have these, warrior societies. They didn't have horses at first until the Spanish brought them. But they had they were not just scattered people, walking in the woods, and all that mythology of Emerson and Thoreau and the woods, but that tangled up woods, they had that was nothing like what existed. And even John Smith, the mercenary John Smith, supposedly the Pocahontas myth, you know him by, but he had been a mercenary in Turkey, fighting the Muslims, Crusades. And they brought him, he was on the first ship to Jamestown, the first discovery, as a mercenary with his band of mercenaries, because they knew they were going to kill people and take the land. But he also did these forays up through, into New England before the Puritans came, scoping it out and mapping it for other colonizations. And he wrote in his diaries about these deer parks and these that he could do a carriage, take carriages through, among the trees because they were spaced so well, that. So there's plenty of, of evidence, of documentation of the enormous food production of the Haudenosaunee, most famously, and in the Southwest desert of the greatest farmers in North America, corn, squash, and beans in a desert. So from the wooded area to the desert, there was always food from the ground that was important.
Okay, got a question. Against resurgent fascism today, the dominant strategy on the left is the fight for universal middle classes in a more inclusive settler colony, similar to the social democracy that failed against Hitler and the Nazis. Meanwhile, warnings of another recession are rising, while even the hosts of the daytime talk show The View are now warning of an unfolding quasi-constitutional coup. Rather than recognizing that the actual alternative looks more like the communalism Dakota, Lakota, and Marcella Gilbert wrote about as emerging at Standing Rock, and beyond what Kim Tallbear refers to the nuclear family as an institution of settler colonial oppression, the left seems to be walking the cliff. How do we talk about land repatriation and systemic communal alternatives of Maroon and Indigenous democracy without alienating people who are still only thinking in terms of saving the settler state?
Well, that was a good education in itself. Thank you. I don't have much to add to that, but because it was said very well, land back is the principal motto of all Native people in US, Canada, Latin America, everywhere. Land, traditional land back. But what a lot of people don't know is they're not talking about land that's in private property, although during the New Deal, there was a Native New Deal as well for a very short time. There was a commitment to when any white land that had been taken from Native people and narrowed down their land base, when it would come up for sale, the federal government was obligated to buy it and to return it. And that happened for a while. Because they were, the reservations had been shrunken, and most of that land was being taken illegally. But it's the federal lands that were taken illegally on a large scale. Everything that's called federal land now is land that was taken without treaty by the United States, and not, a treaty that then they could put it up for sale, because Native Americans recognized any treaty that they made that was a legitimate treaty and not a forced treaty, like putting Cherokees in a shed and forcing them to sign that they're going to do the Trail of Tears and then forcing them out by the army. That's not a legitimate treaty. But there are many legitimate treaties. The Sioux Treaty of 1868, that's what they want, is the restoration of the land. The Black Hills are taken later. They want the restoration of the land as it was then, and that's most of North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, Wyoming, and part of Nebraska. They want a nation. Basically they have the right to self-determination in international law. So some want nationhoods, probably one day. not too far away, the Navajo Nation will try for independence. It has the best chance now, but the broadening of the land so that they can have actually existing polities, which they had in the past, but they're so impoverished and they're so restricted and they're under trust. They're not owned by the Indians. Congress, Senate could, with a stroke of a pen, wipe out all the reservations today. No land base whatsoever. And I think that, there are some Republicans who want to do that. And it was done in 1953 with the Termination Act. That was a congressional act to do away with all reservations and forcibly, with a carrot, not a stick, relocate all the Indian people. So they thought if they can get this relocation plan, the young people to leave, the old people would die, and the young people saw the big city and they wouldn't want to come back. Well, that didn't work out. That evoked the Red Power movement, took the Red Power movement 20 years to get that reversed.
Isn't it, Roxanne, because of the psychology of erasure, I think many people don't realize that there are contemporary land struggles. There was just a case, I believe, in northern Michigan where the Ojibwe lost a court case claiming land in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan.
Right.
In Oklahoma, there's ongoing arguments about applying a Supreme Court decision that awarded additional land rights to Indigenous people in Oklahoma. And one other thing that I learned from you that I think people don't know is that I believe it's the most recent Supreme Court decision, which was denying land rights to Indigenous people, was enthusiastically written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I mean, again, this psychology of white land ownership and entitlement runs across the political spectrum and very deep. And I wonder if you want to comment a little about that. I don't know where we're at on time here, but I'm fine to keep going as long as whatever.
Yeah, we really need to start wrapping up. This recording will be available on our YouTube channel shortly and within the next few days. And I believe we'll also be sending it to registrants. Is that correct, Francis?
That is correct.
All right. Roxanne, Frank, thank you very much for your time. I know I learned quite a bit.
Thank you.
Right.
We'll do it again.
Me too.
Well, there was
Thanks,
one
everyone, again.
Frank, thank you, Francis.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay,
All
thank
of
you.
you.
Thank you so much.
And all
Thanks,
of you.
everyone, for coming.
Yes, thank
Bye.
you.